Imagine a man who was certain he would never become a soldier. He believed that taking a life was a sin, tried in every possible way to avoid the front, and even sought the status of a conscientious objector. But fate had other plans. In the midst of Europe's forests, he found himself facing dozens of machine guns and hundreds of enemies, and later military investigators wondered how one man managed to stop an entire battalion. Bullets tore through the ground and bushes all around, yet not a single one touched him. German officers admitted in their testimonies that they could not understand the secret. But the most astonishing part began after he returned home. He was offered incredible sums of money, worldwide fame, contracts, and advertising, yet he rejected all of it and chose a path that nearly ended in disaster for his family. Why did a war hero choose obscurity, and what consequences did his decision bring? You will find out in this video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. The story begins not with war, but with hunger. In the mountains of Tennessee, if you couldn't shoot, your family didn't eat. It was that simple. Alvin Cullum York was born on December 13, 1887, in a one-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee. The cabin sat on land his great-great-grandfather had settled generations before, starting with nothing but a cave carved into the hillside. That cave still existed during Alvin's childhood, converted into the blacksmith shop where his father taught him to work iron and steel. The York family farmed 75 acres of mountain land, but farming alone couldn't feed 11 children. Hunting wasn't recreational for them, it was survival. And young Alvin had a gift that would shape everything that followed. By age 10, he could consistently decapitate wild turkeys with a single shot from a Civil War-era muzzle-loading rifle. Not wound them, not kill them with body shots that would waste meat. Decapitate them with black powder weapons that required perfect aim and timing. The nearest town held shooting competitions every weekend. Winners didn't receive cash prizes, they received quarters of beef cattle. Alvin would walk miles into town, compete with his muzzleloader against more modern rifles, win all 4 events, and walk the entire living cow back home rather than carry butchered meat. This wasn't showmanship. This was a teenager helping his family survive. But those skills, honed by necessity in the Tennessee mountains, would prove useful in ways young Alvin could never imagine. His father died in 1911. Alvin, suddenly responsible for his mother and 8 younger siblings, struggled with the weight of that responsibility. The devout Christian boy who had never missed church began drinking heavily. The marksman who had never used his skills in anger began getting into fights. For 3 years, Alvin York was a different man. He drank, gambled, and fought his way through every saloon between Tennessee and Kentucky. His preferred establishment, the Blind Tiger, straddled the state line with a painted stripe down the middle of the floor. When Tennessee law enforcement arrived, troublemakers simply stepped across the line into Kentucky territory. But on New Year's Eve, 1914, everything changed. His mother stayed awake all night waiting for him to come home from another drinking binge. When he stumbled through the door at 3 in the morning, she asked him a simple question that shattered something inside him. "When are you going to start being the man your father and grandfathers were?" Alvin collapsed to his knees, sobbing in his mother's lap. He promised to change. And on January 1st, 1915, he did exactly that. He quit drinking, quit gambling, quit fighting. He returned to church and within months became an elder, teaching Sunday school to children. He also fell in love with a girl named Gracie Williams who lived down the road. They would meet privately to talk for hours. but never kissed, never even held hands. Her father didn't trust Alvin's reformation and refused to approve their marriage. Alvin accepted this judgment. He knew he had to prove himself over time. His plan was simple: live righteously, win Gracie's father's approval, marry the woman he loved, and spend the rest of his days farming, blacksmithing, and raising a family in the mountains where his ancestors had lived for generations. Then, in September 1917, a red card arrived from Washington. The draft notice landed like a thunderbolt in Alvin's carefully reconstructed world. As a devout Christian who took "thou shalt not kill" literally, York requested conscientious objector status. On the draft card, where it asked him to explain his reasoning, he wrote simply, "I don't want to fight." The request was denied. His pastor helped him file an appeal with sworn statements from both of them, explaining York's religious convictions. That appeal was also denied. The problem was timing and denomination. York belonged to a Pentecostal church, a relatively new Christian sect that wasn't widely recognized by draft boards. Conscientious objector status was typically reserved for established pacifist groups like Quakers, Amish, and Mennonites. Mainstream Christian denominations were expected to serve. By November, York had orders to report for duty. By February 1918, he was assigned to G Company of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division. The 82nd was unique among World War I divisions. Instead of drawing from a single region, it included soldiers from every state and immigrants from dozens of countries. 20% of its members weren't even born in America. For a mountain man who had rarely traveled 60 miles from home, the cultural shock was overwhelming. But something unexpected happened during training. York excelled at everything the Army taught him. Even as he continued filing paperwork requesting conscientious objector status. His marksmanship was so superior that fellow soldiers would gather to watch him shoot. He could consistently hit bullseyes that others missed completely. His commanding officer, Captain Edward Danforth, noticed York keeping a diary, which violated military regulations. When confronted, York refused to lie but wouldn't confirm or deny its existence either. "Sir, I'm not saying whether I do or whether I don't," he replied. Danforth pressed him about the security risk. York's response revealed everything about his character. "Sir, I didn't come here to fight in a war and get captured. If the Germans want to get any intelligence out of me, they're going to have to get it out of my dead body." Impressed by York's honesty, Danforth kicked the conscientious objector request up the chain of command to Colonel G. Edward Buxton. Buxton, also a devout Christian, called York into his office for a theological debate that would change everything. "Do you believe everything in the Bible?" Buxton asked. "Yes, sir, absolutely," York replied. Buxton quoted Luke 22, "He who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." York fired back with scripture supporting pacifism. For over an hour, the two men traded Bible verses like weapons in an intellectual duel. Finally, Buxton delivered the verse that shattered York's worldview. Ezekiel 33, about the watchman who sees danger coming and must warn the people. "If the watchman sees the sword coming and blows no trumpet, the blood of the people is on his hands." York had his answer. Maybe he wasn't meant to avoid this war. Maybe he was meant to be the watchman. Meanwhile, his family and pastor had been writing politicians trying to get his conscientious objector status approved. The paperwork finally came through. All York had to do was sign his name, and he would be exempt from combat. Captain Danforth gave him 10 days leave to decide. York went home, saw Gracie, then disappeared into the mountains with his Bible. For 36 hours, he sat on his favorite rock, reading scripture and praying without food or water. When he came down from that mountain, his mind was made up. He would go to war. Whether divine intervention or psychological transformation, something fundamental had changed in Alvin York. The reluctant draftee had become something far more dangerous, a man who believed he was on a mission from God. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest military operation in United States history, involving over 1 million American soldiers. To put that in perspective, 11 entire states have fewer people living in them today than the number of soldiers who participated in this single battle. York's division shipped out in May 1918. The farm boy who had never seen an ocean was awestruck by the Atlantic's beauty, then violently seasick for the entire voyage. They reached France in June and spent the summer rotating through reserve positions, facing sporadic artillery and sniper fire. During this period, York's faith manifested in ways that unnerved his fellow soldiers. While others dove for cover during artillery barrages, York would stand calmly, convinced God would protect him. He wrote in his diary that enemy sniper fire sounded like angry bumblebees when I used to rob their nests back home. His attitude toward danger seemed almost supernatural. He wrote, "There's no use worrying about shells if you can't alter things. Just ask God to help you and accept it. Men who worry destroy their peace of mind without doing any good." By October, the 82nd Division was positioned near Chhatel-Chéhéry, facing heavily fortified German positions. The Germans had occupied these hills for 4 years, constructing elaborate defensive works with interlocking fields of fire. On October 8th, York's battalion was ordered to capture German positions near Hill 223 along the Decauville Railroad. The initial assault failed catastrophically. Direct attacks across open ground against entrenched machine gun positions proved futile. Military commanders decided to send a small patrol to infiltrate behind German lines and neutralize the machine gun nests from the rear. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option left. 17 men were selected for this mission: 1 sergeant, 3 corporals including York, and 13 privates. As they prepared to advance, American artillery that had been scheduled to support the attack finally arrived, perfectly timed to provide cover as the patrol crossed exposed ground. Whether coincidence or providence, the timing was flawless. The patrol reached German-held territory undetected. For an hour and a half, they crept through dense forest, following what they thought was the correct route to outflank the German positions. When the sergeant consulted his corporals about whether they had gone far enough, the first 2 recommended turning toward the German positions immediately. York disagreed. Something told him they needed to continue straight. The sergeant accepted his recommendation. That decision proved crucial. Continuing straight led them to an abandoned property line trench, invisible to German observers, that guided them directly behind enemy lines. Had they turned when the other corporals suggested, they would have walked into prepared German defensive positions. Instead, they discovered something unexpected: a meadow where 70 German soldiers were eating lunch, their rifles stacked nearby, completely unaware that Americans had penetrated their lines. The patrol burst into the meadow, weapons raised, demanding surrender. The German soldiers, caught completely off guard and separated from their weapons, complied immediately. They assumed this was the vanguard of a major American assault. 2 German soldiers who had been filling canteens at a nearby creek escaped into the woods and ran to alert their battalion commander, Lieutenant Paul Vollmer. Vollmer grabbed his pistol and rushed toward the meadow, expecting to rally his men for a counterattack. Instead, he found 70 of his soldiers standing with their hands raised, surrounded by what appeared to be a small American patrol. York confronted Vollmer directly, demanding surrender. Vollmer, who had attended college in Chicago and spoke fluent English, tried to assess the situation. Before he could respond, German machine gunners on the surrounding hills spotted the commotion and opened fire on their own positions, trying to break up what they assumed was an American attack. The machine gun fire was devastating. Within seconds, 6 Americans were killed and 3 wounded, leaving only 8 men operational. Among the casualties were the sergeant and 2 other corporals, leaving York as the only remaining leader. York ordered his surviving men to take cover and guard the prisoners. Then he did something that defied all military logic. He advanced alone toward the machine gun positions. What followed was an exhibition of marksmanship that military historians still struggle to explain. York methodically eliminated German machine gun crews, killing at least 25 enemy soldiers while under continuous fire from multiple positions. His technique was unconventional. Rather than shooting the nearest threats first, York worked from the rear of German formations forward, using tactics he had learned hunting wild geese. This prevented surviving Germans from scattering and maintained the element of surprise. When York exhausted his rifle ammunition, 12 German soldiers fixed bayonets and charged his position. York drew his Colt 1911 pistol, loaded with 8 rounds. He needed to be perfect. The lead German soldier watched in confusion as York's bullets seemed to miss repeatedly, whistling past him as he charged. Only when the soldier behind him fell, then the one behind him, did he realize what was happening. York was shooting the rear of the formation first, preventing the others from taking cover. All 7 charging Germans fell before York's final bullet dropped the man in front. Throughout this engagement, Lieutenant Vollmer was firing at York with his own pistol from behind, trying to save his men. Every shot missed. York never received so much as a scratch. When the firing stopped, Vollmer dropped his weapon and attempted to communicate in English. York, pointing his reloaded pistol at the German officer, ordered him to call for the surrender of the remaining machine gun positions. Vollmer shouted commands in German. Within minutes, more German soldiers emerged from their positions, weapons abandoned, hands raised. The final tally was staggering. York had captured 132 German prisoners and neutralized 35 machine gun positions. When one of York's surviving soldiers expressed concern about marching so many prisoners back to American lines with so few guards, Vollmer overheard and asked in amazement how many Americans they actually had. York's response was characteristically modest. "I've got plenty. Don't worry about it." Getting over 100 German prisoners back to American lines presented a logistical nightmare. York couldn't risk the route they had used to infiltrate German territory. Dense forest would make controlling so many prisoners impossible. Vollmer suggested taking a gully that would lead directly back to Hill 223. York suspected a trap and chose instead to march directly down the main road through German-held territory. It was an audacious decision that should have resulted in disaster. Instead, they encountered a German platoon guarding the road. The Germans initially assumed the Americans were prisoners being escorted by their own forces. By the time they realized the truth, York had his pistol pressed against Vollmer's back, ordering him to demand their surrender as well. The additional German soldiers complied, bringing York's prisoner count even higher. They continued marching toward American lines, an impossible sight. 8 Americans escorting well over 100 German soldiers down a main road in broad daylight. When American forces spotted the approaching formation, they initially prepared for a massive German counterattack. Only when they recognized York's distinctive red hair through field glasses did they realize what had actually happened. The division commander met them at the base of Hill 223, promoted York to sergeant on the spot, and began counting prisoners as they marched past. The final count was 132. York's actions had eliminated a significant portion of German defensive capability in that sector. The remaining machine gun positions, now without coordination or reinforcement, were quickly overrun by American forces. Military investigators struggled to verify York's story. It seemed too extraordinary to be true. They interviewed York multiple times, always receiving the same modest, consistent account. They interviewed the 7 surviving American soldiers, who unanimously described York's actions as superhuman. They even interviewed German prisoners, including Vollmer, who confirmed every detail. The investigation revealed physical evidence that supported York's account. The patch of ground where he had made his stand was riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, yet he had emerged unscathed. His canteen, dropped during the firefight, contained 18 bullet holes, but York himself had not been touched. Initially recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, York's award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor after the thorough investigation confirmed his extraordinary actions. Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Allied Commander, personally awarded York the French Croix de Guerre, declaring his actions the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier of all the armies of Europe. But perhaps the most telling detail came from York's own diary entry that night. "You can see here in this case of mine where God helped me out. I'm a witness to the fact that God did help me out of that hard battle, for the bushes were shot up all around me, and I never got a scratch." 3 days after York's heroic action, Germany began seeking armistice terms. The war ended on November 11, 1918, just as York was returning from leave. York returned to America as the most famous soldier in the country. Publishers offered him $10,000 for his autobiography. Hollywood offered $50,000 for film rights. Speaking engagements promised thousands more. York refused everything. He didn't want fame or fortune for taking human lives, even in war. He simply wanted to return to Tennessee, marry Gracie, and live quietly on his family's land. But eventually, York realized his celebrity could serve a greater purpose. Growing up, he had received only a third-grade education because no school existed in his remote area. Thousands of mountain children faced the same limitation. York began accepting speaking engagements, book deals, and eventually film rights, but with a singular purpose. Every dollar would fund education for underprivileged children. He worked for years, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars while paying himself only enough to keep his family fed. The York Institute opened in Jamestown, Tennessee, as a privately funded school offering free education to rural children. York personally supervised its operation, ensuring quality education reached students who would otherwise have none. But York's limited education created an unexpected problem. He believed his charitable work qualified for tax exemptions and failed to pay federal taxes on his earnings. The Internal Revenue Service disagreed. By the 1940s, York owed nearly $90,000 in back taxes on earnings he had already donated to education. His total net worth was $21,000, almost entirely consisting of his family farm. He had $2.20 in his checking account. The irony was crushing. America's greatest war hero faced financial ruin for the crime of educating poor children. Congress intervened with special legislation forgiving York's tax debt. The York Institute became a public school, continuing its mission under government oversight. It operates to this day as a testament to one man's vision that education could transform lives. York's influence extended far beyond his own battlefield heroics. The 1941 film Sergeant York, for which he served as technical advisor, inspired thousands of Americans to enlist as World War II approached. Among them was Audie Murphy, who would become the most decorated soldier of that conflict. The 82nd Infantry Division, partly due to York's fame, was reactivated as the 82nd Airborne Division and remains one of America's most elite military units. But York's true legacy wasn't measured in medals or movie tickets. It was measured in the children who received educations they otherwise would never have had. The mountain boy who left school after 3rd grade had created opportunities for generations of students to escape the cycle of poverty and limited prospects. York spent his final years quietly, farming the same land his ancestors had worked, attending the same church where he had found redemption. He died in 1964 at age 76, having lived to see the school he founded flourish and the ideals he fought for endure. The German corporal who surrendered to York at Chhatel-Chéhéry had been puzzled by something. How could soldiers from such diverse backgrounds fight so effectively together? York understood what the German could not. American strength came not from racial purity or cultural uniformity, but from shared commitment to freedom and equality. York wrote about this realization. They can't get it through their thick heads that it's not your creed or your birthplace or the color of your eyes that makes an American. It's our freedom and equality under the Constitution and our Bill of Rights that makes an American an almighty fighter. Once a man has tasted that freedom, he'd rather die fighting than do without it for himself and his children. Alvin York's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when our deepest convictions collide with our greatest responsibilities? York believed taking human life was wrong. He spent years trying to avoid military service. Yet when circumstances demanded action, he didn't hesitate to protect the innocent, even if it meant compromising his own moral certainties. His post-war choices were equally revealing. Fame and fortune meant nothing to him compared to the opportunity to serve others. He sacrificed personal wealth for the chance to educate children, then sacrificed his privacy to raise funds for that education. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of York's story isn't what he accomplished in 30 minutes of combat, but what he chose to do with the remaining 46 years of his life. The man who reluctantly became a warrior spent decades proving that true heroism often occurs far from any battlefield. In an age when celebrity culture dominates public attention, York's example raises questions about the relationship between fame and responsibility, between personal conviction and public duty, between individual achievement and collective benefit. The teenage boy who could decapitate turkeys with antique rifles became a man who could reshape young minds with modern education. The reluctant warrior who captured 132 enemy soldiers became a peacetime general in the war against ignorance and poverty. Alvin York understood something that eluded many of his contemporaries and continues to challenge us today. Real victory isn't measured by enemies defeated, but by lives elevated. The greatest battles aren't always fought with weapons, but with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering commitment to principles larger than ourselves. The hillbilly blacksmith who wanted nothing more than to be left alone ended up demonstrating that sometimes the most reluctant heroes make the most lasting impact. Sometimes the people who least want power are exactly the ones who should have it. York's legacy reminds us that heroism isn't about seeking glory or avoiding responsibility. It's about recognizing when circumstances demand more from us than we think we can give, then finding the courage to give it anyway. In the end, the man who tried so hard to avoid taking lives spent his remaining years dedicated to building them instead. And perhaps that transformation, more than any battlefield exploit, explains why we still remember the name Alvin York more than a century after he walked out of those Tennessee mountains and into history. The reluctant warrior had found his true calling not in war, but in the peace that follows it. Not in destruction, but in the patient work of construction that rebuilds what conflict tears down. When York returned to New York Harbor in May 1919, reporters swarmed the docks. The American public was hungry for heroes after the devastating war, and York's story provided exactly what they needed. Within days, his modest Tennessee cabin was buried under sacks of mail from across the country. As early as 1919, Jesse Lasky from Hollywood had attempted to convince York to sell his story for the silver screen. The offers were staggering for a man who had grown up with nothing. Publishers promised $10,000 for his autobiography. Hollywood studios offered $50,000 for film rights. Product endorsement deals promised even more. Vaudeville promoters wanted to put him on stage. Newspaper syndicates offered five-figure sums for serialized accounts of his battle. Madison Avenue advertisers wanted to use his image to sell everything from cigarettes to rifles to breakfast cereal. York turned down everything. When reporters asked why, his answer was always the same: he couldn't profit from doing his duty. Taking money for killing men, even enemy soldiers, felt wrong to him. The medals he had received were honor enough. His fellow soldiers didn't understand his refusal. Many had returned to unemployment and poverty. They watched York reject enough money to secure his family's future for generations, while continuing to live in the same one-room cabin where he had grown up. But York's reasoning ran deeper than simple modesty. He had wrestled with the morality of taking human life and concluded that his actions were justified only because they served a greater good. Profiting from those deaths would transform justified killing into something else entirely. The pressure to capitalize on his fame was relentless. Every day brought new offers, each more lucrative than the last. Journalists camped outside his cabin. Photographers followed him to church. Promoters tracked him to his favorite hunting spots. York's response was characteristically direct. He posted a sign outside his cabin that read, "This is my home. All I want is to be left alone." When that failed to deter visitors, he simply disappeared into the mountains for weeks at a time. But by the mid-1920s, York began reconsidering his position, not because he wanted wealth, but because he recognized an opportunity to address a problem that had shaped his entire life: the lack of educational opportunities for mountain children. York had received what he called a third-grade education from subscription schools that operated only a few months each year. When Alvin York responded to his draft notice, he typified the underprivileged, undereducated conscript who traveled to France, and his military service had made him painfully aware of his educational limitations. He watched city soldiers discuss books he had never heard of, reference historical events he knew nothing about, and solve problems using mathematical concepts he couldn't grasp. The experience was humbling, but also illuminating. Education, York realized, was the key to breaking the cycle of poverty that trapped mountain families. If he could use his fame to fund schools, the compromise might be worthwhile. The money he earned from his story could give other children opportunities he had never had. When York finally agreed to consider selling his story to Hollywood, he imposed conditions that reflected his values and priorities. When informed that Hollywood wanted to make a film about his exploits in World War I, Alvin C. York insisted that only Gary Cooper could play him. York's reasoning was simple. Cooper projected the quiet dignity and moral conviction that York wanted associated with his story. Cooper was also known for avoiding scandal and maintaining a clean public image, qualities York considered essential. But York's conditions went far beyond casting. He demanded that his future wife be portrayed by an actress who didn't smoke or drink, reflecting Gracie's conservative Christian values. He insisted that the film emphasize his religious transformation rather than glorifying violence. Most importantly, he negotiated for a percentage of profits to be donated directly to his educational foundation. The negotiations took years. Hollywood executives struggled to understand why York would complicate a lucrative deal with moral stipulations. They offered him larger upfront payments to simply approve the project and walk away. York refused. He wanted creative control over how his story was told. War films typically glorified combat and minimized its human cost. York insisted his movie acknowledge both the necessity of his actions and their moral weight. The script had to show his reluctance to fight and his post-war dedication to peaceful pursuits. Warner Brothers eventually agreed to York's terms, partly because the approaching Second World War made his story particularly relevant. Americans needed examples of principled courage as they faced another global conflict. The film, released in 1941, became a massive success. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The movie inspired thousands of young men to enlist in the military as America entered World War II. York served as technical advisor throughout production, ensuring historical accuracy while approving artistic liberties that served the story's larger message. He spent weeks on set, coaching Cooper on Tennessee dialect and mountain mannerisms. The film's success vindicated York's patient approach to negotiations. By maintaining control over his story, he had created both effective entertainment and powerful inspiration while directing substantial profits toward education. The York Institute was founded as a private agricultural school in 1926, but York's vision for the school had been developing since his return from France. York began raising money for a high school to cater to rural children in 1919 and secured private and public funds. The fundraising campaign was exhausting but exhilarating. York traveled across the country, speaking at Rotary Club meetings, church gatherings, and civic organizations. His message was always the same. Education was the pathway out of poverty for mountain children. His speaking style was unpolished, but compelling. York never used prepared speeches, preferring to speak directly from his heart about the children who deserved better opportunities. Audiences responded to his authenticity and obvious passion for the cause. The initial name for the school, the York Industrial Institute, later changed to the York Agricultural and Industrial Institute, reflected York's belief that the future lay in industry. York envisioned training students in both traditional academic subjects and practical skills that would prepare them for modern employment. The school's location in Jamestown, Tennessee, was carefully chosen. It sat at the center of several rural counties where educational opportunities were practically non-existent. Students could attend from across the region, many boarding at the school during the week and returning home on weekends. York personally supervised every aspect of the school's construction and operation. He interviewed teachers, approved curriculum, and even helped design dormitories. His involvement wasn't ceremonial. He understood that his name alone wouldn't create quality education. The institute began offering classes in 1929, serving students who had few other options for secondary education. The curriculum combined traditional academics with agricultural and industrial training, preparing graduates for both college and immediate employment. York's educational philosophy emphasized practical skills alongside moral development. Students learned farming techniques, mechanical skills, and business principles, while also studying literature, mathematics, and science. Character development was integrated throughout the curriculum. The school's success attracted national attention. Educational reformers visited to study York's model of rural education. Government officials praised his innovative approach to addressing regional educational disparities. But maintaining the school required constant fundraising. York spent years traveling, speaking, and soliciting donations. The work was physically and emotionally draining, but he never wavered in his commitment to the children who depended on the opportunities he was creating. In 1951, the Internal Revenue Service accused York of tax evasion regarding profits earned from the movie. The accusation was devastating to a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. York's financial situation by 1951 was desperate. Those assets consisted of $25 in cash, including $2.20 in a checking account, and miscellaneous property worth $30,000, including his family farm. He had given away hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades, keeping only enough to survive. The tax dispute centered on a fundamental misunderstanding. York believed that because he had donated his movie earnings to educational causes, those donations qualified as charitable deductions. The IRS disagreed, arguing that his foundation didn't meet the technical requirements for tax-exempt status. The IRS assessed back taxes of $172,000. For a man with $25 in cash, the debt was impossible to pay. The government threatened to seize his family farm, the same land his ancestors had worked for generations. The irony was painful. York had sacrificed personal wealth to educate poor children, only to face financial ruin for his generosity. The tax laws that were supposed to encourage charitable giving instead punished his unconventional approach to philanthropy. Public outcry was immediate and intense. Veterans organizations rallied to York's defense. Newspapers editorialized about the injustice of persecuting a war hero for his charitable work. Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Sam Rayburn and Congressman Joe L. Evans established the York Relief Fund to help cancel the debt. The case dragged on for years. York, now in his 60s and suffering from poor health, spent his final active years fighting bureaucracy instead of enjoying retirement. The stress affected his marriage and strained his relationship with his children. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, who considered the actions of the IRS a national disgrace, ordered a resolution of the matter. Congress passed special legislation forgiving York's debt, acknowledging that his charitable intentions had been genuine even if his methods were legally flawed. The resolution came almost too late. York's health was failing, and the decade-long legal battle had exhausted his savings and spirit. But he lived to see his school continue operating under state oversight, ensuring that his educational mission would survive. York's influence on subsequent generations of American soldiers was immeasurable. The 1941 film Sergeant York premiered just months before Pearl Harbor, providing a powerful example of courage and sacrifice as America prepared for another world war. Among those inspired by York's story was a young Texas farm boy named Audie Murphy. Murphy enlisted in the Army partly because he wanted to emulate York's heroism. He would go on to become the most decorated American soldier of World War II, earning the Medal of Honor and 27 other decorations. The connection between York and Murphy was more than inspirational. Both came from rural poverty, Both were expert marksmen from childhood. Both struggled with the moral implications of their actions in combat. Murphy often credited York's example with helping him understand how military service could be both necessary and morally justified. York's association with the 82nd Infantry Division also had lasting impact. When the United States reactivated military units for World War II, the 82nd was among the first chosen, partly because of York's fame. The division was redesignated as the 82nd Airborne Division and became one of America's most elite units. The airborne soldiers who jumped into Normandy on D-Day wore the same shoulder patch York had worn in the Argonne Forest. Many carried his story with them as an example of what individual courage could accomplish against overwhelming odds. York remained involved with veterans organizations throughout his life, though he rarely discussed his own combat experiences. He preferred to focus on the living veterans who needed support, rather than relitigate battles from the past. His influence extended beyond military circles. The story of the reluctant warrior who became an educator inspired countless Americans to pursue public service. Teachers, social workers, and community organizers cited York's example when explaining their own commitments to helping others. York's last decades were marked by declining health and persistent financial struggles. York spent his final years battling arthritis, high blood pressure, and the IRS. The man who had survived machine gun fire and enemy artillery was gradually worn down by bureaucracy and age. He suffered several strokes that left him partially paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. The mountain man, who had spent his life outdoors, was reduced to watching the world through his cabin windows. But even in disability, York maintained his dignity and faith. Visitors to his home during these years found him still sharp mentally, despite his physical limitations. He would discuss current events, offer advice to young people, and share stories about his children and grandchildren. He rarely talked about the war unless specifically asked. When he did discuss his military service, York's perspective had evolved. The young man who had agonized over the morality of killing had found peace with his wartime actions. He understood that his moment of violence had prevented far greater violence. His 30 minutes of combat had likely saved hundreds of American lives. But he remained most proud of his post-war accomplishments. The school that bore his name had educated thousands of students. Many had gone on to college, careers, and productive lives they never could have achieved without the opportunities York had created. York died on September 2nd, 1964, at age 76. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, including military officials, politicians, and former students from his institute. The service was held in the same church where he had found redemption decades earlier. President Lyndon Johnson ordered flags flown at half-staff across the nation. The Pentagon sent an honor guard. Veterans organizations from across the country sent representatives. But the most meaningful attendees were the ordinary people whose lives York had touched through his decades of quiet service. He was buried in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, Tennessee, on the same land where his ancestors had lived for generations. His headstone bears a simple inscription: Alvin C. York, Sergeant, World War I, Medal of Honor. No mention of his fame, wealth, or accomplishments. Just the basic facts of duty fulfilled. What transforms an ordinary person into an extraordinary one? York's story offers several possible explanations, each raising more questions than it answers. Some attribute York's battlefield success to divine intervention. The physical evidence supports supernatural interpretation. Hundreds of enemy bullets missing their target, while York's shots found their marks with uncanny precision. Religious believers see confirmation of God's protection for the righteous, Others point to more prosaic explanations. York's childhood had provided ideal training for his wartime role. Growing up hunting for survival had honed marksmanship skills most soldiers never developed. Mountain life had built physical conditioning and mental toughness that proved invaluable in combat. Psychological analysis suggests that York's religious transformation created unshakable self-confidence. The man who believed he was protected by divine providence could act with courage that seemed supernatural to observers. Whether the protection was real or perceived, its effects were undeniably powerful. Military historians note that York's success reflected excellent training and exceptional circumstances. The 82nd Division had prepared him well for infantry combat. The patrol's mission placed him in a position where individual marksmanship could have decisive impact. Luck played a role in the timing and placement that made his heroics possible. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of York's story isn't what happened in France, but what happened afterward. His refusal to profit from fame suggests a moral framework that prioritized service over self-interest. His dedication to education demonstrated understanding that true victory comes from building rather than destroying. The tax troubles that plagued his later years reveal the complexity of translating good intentions into effective action. York's charitable instincts were admirable, but his limited education left him vulnerable to legal problems he couldn't anticipate or navigate. His influence on future generations of soldiers raises questions about the relationship between individual heroism and collective inspiration. Stories like York's become myths that shape national identity and military culture. Whether those myths accurately reflect historical reality may be less important than their power to inspire courage in subsequent conflicts. York's legacy ultimately transcends any single explanation. He was simultaneously a product of his time and place, a beneficiary of extraordinary circumstances, and an individual who made conscious choices about how to use the opportunities fate provided. The reluctant warrior who became an educator demonstrates that heroism takes many forms. Sometimes it requires 30 minutes of incredible courage under fire. Sometimes it requires 30 years of patient work building institutions that outlast any individual achievement. Perhaps the most profound lesson from York's life is that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about recognizing responsibility and accepting it regardless of personal cost. The man who tried so hard to avoid taking lives ended up dedicating his remaining years to building them instead. That transformation, more than any battlefield exploit, may explain why Alvin York's name endures more than a century after he walked out of the Tennessee mountains and into history.